The first shot cracked into the dirt 3 feet below the paper silhouette, and laughter rolled down the concrete firing line like a careless wave. It wasn't cruel at first. It was the kind of laughter people make when they think they've just seen something predictable. The old man lowered the rifle slowly, as if he hadn't even noticed the miss, while a young range officer scribbled a mark on his clipboard and shook his head. A few shooters smirked behind their scopes. Someone whispered, "Time to hang it up, Grandpa." And before another round could echo, a calm voice cut through the noise. "If you love your country and respect your soldiers, hit that subscribe button right now." The old man exhaled, lifted the rifle again, and the story that followed would change how every single person on that range understood the word miss. His name was Daniel Hart, though no one on that firing line knew it. To them, he was just another retired veteran with a stiff walk, faded boots, and a ball cap pulled too low over weathered eyes. He had arrived alone, paid in cash, and chosen lane 13, the one closest to the back wall. It wasn't a position favored by serious competitors. It was for hobbyists, tourists, and people who wanted to feel safe behind extra concrete. Daniel liked it because it reminded him of something he had once learned the hard way. You never choose a position to look impressive. You choose it to survive. The young men around him were loud, confident, and dressed in new tactical gear that still smelled of packaging. They talked about ballistics like they had invented them. They adjusted scopes like surgeons preparing for a televised operation. Every shot they fired was followed by commentary about wind drift, trigger pull, and future upgrades. Daniel said nothing. He loaded one round at a time. When his first shot landed low, one of the younger shooters actually laughed out loud. Another shook his head with sympathy, like he was watching a grandfather struggle with modern technology. The range officer, a fit man in his early 30s with mirrored sunglasses, glanced through binoculars and called out, "Low miss. 3 feet under." Daniel nodded politely, as if he accepted the verdict. Inside his chest, however, a memory stirred. A desert wind, a rooftop, a command whispered through dust and smoke. "Miss low. Let them think you missed." He fired again. Another round struck low. The laughter grew louder, more comfortable now. Confidence spread across the line. A story was forming in their minds. The old veteran who had lost his edge. Daniel adjusted his stance, just slightly. Not the rifle. His feet. The third shot hit low again. The range officer sighed, walked closer, and offered politely, "Sir, you might want to check your zero." Daniel smiled faintly. It was the kind of smile that carried no pride, no offense, no explanation. Just patience. "I know where it's zeroed," he said softly. That should have been the first warning. He waited longer before the fourth shot. He let the range settle into expectation. He allowed the whispers to fade into comfortable certainty. Then he squeezed the trigger again. The fourth round didn't hit the paper either. But this time, the sound behind the target was different. Not a flat thud. A sharp metallic snap. The range officer frowned. He lifted the binoculars again, scanning behind the paper silhouette instead of on it. His posture changed. Daniel finally lowered the rifle completely. Silence crept into the firing line, replacing laughter with confusion. The range officer adjusted focus. He leaned closer to the binoculars, then pulled them away slowly, as if he had just seen something he wasn't sure he believed. He walked forward. Each step felt heavier than the last. Daniel stayed exactly where he was. When the officer reached the target stand, he froze. Behind the paper silhouette, on the metal support frame that held the target upright, were 4 perfectly aligned bullet holes. Not scattered, not random, not lucky. A straight vertical line. Each round had passed through the same structural beam at different distances, creating a precision pattern that no casual shooter could reproduce by accident. The officer swallowed. He turned back toward the firing line, and his voice changed. "Everyone, cease fire." The words dropped like a weight. People looked up from their rifles. Conversations died mid-sentence. The range, once full of confidence and noise, now felt like a courtroom awaiting a verdict. The officer raised his hand and pointed at Daniel. "Sir," he said carefully, "did you intend to miss the target?" Daniel met his eyes calmly. "I intended to hit what mattered." A few people chuckled nervously. unsure whether it was a joke. The officer didn't smile. He walked back with the target frame, dragging it into full view. When everyone saw the line of holes in the metal behind the paper, the mood shifted instantly. The laughter didn't return. The silence deepened. One of the younger shooters whispered, "No way." Daniel finally stood up. His joints protested softly, but his posture remained straight. He walked toward the frame, pointing gently. "You aim for paper," he said quietly. "I aim for what holds it up." The range officer stared at him with new eyes. "What unit were you with?" he asked. Daniel shook his head slowly. That part doesn't matter anymore. But the story was no longer his to control. The range officer examined the metal beam more closely. He ran his finger along the line of holes, noticing the spacing, the consistency, the angle of entry. His training told him what his mouth hadn't yet said. This wasn't luck. This wasn't aging hands. This was discipline refined beyond ego. He cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen, these shots weren't misses. They were demonstrations." Daniel didn't correct him. He didn't claim credit. He simply leaned against the bench and waited, like a man who had waited his entire life for nothing at all. The officer finally looked up. "Sir, most shooters aim center mass. You aim below. What?" Daniel's eyes drifted toward the far wall of the range, where faint marks from years of training still whispered of thousands of stories. "Because in real life," he said softly, "targets don't stand still, and paper doesn't stop anything." He explained calmly how he had trained to hit load-bearing points, vehicle frames, structural joints, and mechanical weaknesses. How he had learned that sometimes the most important target was never the one everyone was looking at. The younger shooters listened now without interruption. Their rifles rested quietly on their benches. Daniel continued, not as a lecture, but as a memory unfolding. He spoke about a night operation where a single shot into the wrong surface would have collapsed a stairwell. About how he once ended a firefight by disabling a door frame instead of the men behind it. About how precision was not about pride, but about ending chaos with the smallest possible movement. No one laughed. The range officer finally asked his name. "Daniel Hart," he answered. Recognition sparked faintly in the officer's eyes. Not from fame, from records, from training materials, from old case studies that were whispered about but rarely discussed. You're that Hart," he said quietly. Daniel only nodded. The officer straightened and spoke to the range like a student addressing a master without realizing it. "Sir, would you be willing to demonstrate again?" Daniel hesitated. Then he nodded once. A fresh target was raised. The paper stood clean and untouched, waiting for expectations to repeat themselves. Daniel loaded a single round. He fired. The paper remained untouched, but the stand behind it shifted slightly. He fired again. The support bar cracked. He fired a third time. The entire frame tilted and collapsed forward, the paper fluttering down like a defeated flag. The range stood frozen. Daniel lowered the rifle and set it gently on the bench. "Targets fall when you stop focusing on the picture," he said quietly, "and start understanding the structure." For a moment, nobody spoke. Then one of the young shooters removed his ear protection and said softly, "I thought you missed." Daniel smiled kindly. "So did I," he replied. For a long time. The range officer stepped forward and shook his hand, not with excitement, but with respect. "You taught us something today," he said. Daniel nodded. "You reminded me of something too," he answered. "That people don't laugh because they're cruel. They laugh because they haven't learned yet." He packed his rifle slowly, carefully, as if every movement carried history. The younger shooters watched him with quiet admiration, not because he was better, but because he was humble. As Daniel walked toward the exit, the range felt different. Not quieter, not louder, just wiser. The paper targets were replaced, but nobody aimed at them the same way again. Outside, Daniel paused under the open sky. He inhaled deeply, feeling the weight of years he no longer needed to prove. Some victories don't echo. They simply settle. And in that settling, respect is born. If this story moved you, challenged you, or reminded you of the power of quiet strength, then tell us in the comments. From which part of the country are you watching this video?